Hi, I'm Peter. Like you said, I'm the platform team lead here in Amsterdam. I'm going to be presenting about how to build up your development organization and work in a multi-team workflow so that you can move even faster, have an even higher velocity experience as a development organization. So the first thing to know about me is I'm a real developer. I've got the blue sticker, but I also lead the team. So I care a lot about developer productivity. I care a lot about workflow and how we deploy quickly, how we move fast as an organization. That's me again. So we have these slogans, mottos about what we want our product to be. We want it to be the open and intelligent DXP, open to plug in whatever best of breed technologies you have in your organization, but also your own back-end systems, the special sauce of your organization. That means we have to be flexible to make this platform fit the situation you have in your own organization, your own government, your organization, your business, whatever. We want to move fast so we can keep up with the pace of expectations. So we have all these technologies that you can mix and match in various ways. This is focused on the Experience Manager CMS side, but there's already lots of different ways you can build up a site, and often you have multiple sites that behave in different ways for different purposes. So you might have one that's focused on server-side rendered pages. You might have others that are using SPA-type technology on the front end and just using APIs to pull in the content. And then you have these other services and logic around that for dynamic targeting, integration logic, et cetera. So one problem with this flexibility is that once you get launched with any individual project, you still have this problem of scaling up across your organization. You can prove out with an experiment, but then when it works, you want to go big. And the flexibility often has some downsides with it as well. So you have reusable components that you can use in building your web experience, but people want to tweak it. That they have a use case that's almost the same, and so you end up with these complex components that have to behave slightly differently, and code reuse can be a little difficult. The configuration in your site map is inheritable, so you can have reusable structures, but then it also introduces the possibility of conflicts when different teams want to modify core behaviors. And similarly with integration logic, you can sometimes have like slight variations on a theme, and then you need to manage dependencies. So it leads to this anti-pattern where people feel like they need to test the world on every deployment across all of the various sites that are run through the platform. And we weren't satisfied with that. We don't want this sad experience where you just want to tweak one thing on one site, and then it feels like there's this friction in getting that deployed to your customers. So there's an approach that's worked in the past for some organizations where you basically run multiple instances of the platform. So you separate the repositories, and you have your code and your content, your configuration all kind of deployed independently. And that does work in some cases, but there are also some downsides to this. So you could be more confident that your systems are independent, so you can deploy independently at different times. But the downside is now your editors have to work in multiple systems, and it's more difficult to reuse content across sites because they're essentially foreign systems interacting. And of course, you're maintaining multiple systems. It's harder to coordinate your personalization across different sites, et cetera, because you have to somehow aggregate the data from these different systems. So it works. It can be a good strategy in some cases where the downsides are not so important. Maybe you have really disparate editor teams that don't combine content a lot, so this can work, but we were not satisfied with this. We have a really strong engineering culture working on this product, and we wanted to really think through what's the core problem here, and how do we build something that can last in a long period of time with a large organization and support all these different use cases. So we came back to this core idea that The approach we really want is to share the content management, the interaction with the editors, the organization of the content into the structure that makes sense for you, but separate the delivery tier so that the sites can evolve independently, they can use slightly different approaches for their architecture, et cetera. And you basically get all of the benefits without any of the costs. So, there's this sort of grand paradise of how do we get all of these things all at the same time? Well, we have to do a bunch of stuff. What is this stuff? Like, how does it work? If you really want to know the internals, you want to see the block diagram type stuff, you should really go to Atadama's talk this afternoon, where he goes through the internal structure of how the code has changed. But the good thing is, for the most part, it's pretty simple for you as a developer on an actual project. Most of the change impacts us. We did a lot of work to make sure that the impact on you guys and how you work with the product is a positive, low impact experience. So I'll go through all that stuff that changed, but piece by piece here. So first off, there's this core configuration node in the repository. If you've worked with the Experience Manager product before, you know that you store sitemap information in here, your list of components, the catalog of components that your end users can drag into the page structure, and all that stuff is stored in this root node in the repository, HST. And what we've basically done is just add some brothers and sisters to that node that's been there. So you can have an HST, my corporate site, an HST, my mobile site. If you really need to diverge and you have different development teams that are working at different paces, you isolate the configuration that drives those experiences so that they can really be independent of each other. And that allows you to avoid all of the potential conflicts in trying to maintain code reuse, but also independence. To make that work, there's a couple things that we wanted to do. The first is moving that configuration, sort of where it's packaged, where it's managed, from the CMS war to the site war. A pretty simple change in theory. If you've already organized your configuration using version 12, it's pretty simple. You just copy some files from one place to another, but it means that it's deployed when your site war is deployed, not when the CMS war is deployed, and that means the sites can evolve independently of the CMS. And that really enables a different way of working where your site teams can be more independent. It also meant that a lot of the product code that really drives the CMS, there's certain internal APIs that we use to provide extra metadata so that the CMS can work properly. That was previously embedded in the site war. There was code artifacts that we provide, but you would build into the site. And we've sort of cleaned that up so that now all of the product's internal workings are managed in the CMS war. That's sort of the central point where the core platform can be maintained. And the site just interacts with a very thin, better managed API interface. So in the end, what this means to you guys is the upgrade will involve some change to the Maven dependencies. There might be some changes to the submodules in your project, but it's relatively simple. This is just the core concept. Let's put the things that are really tied to the delivery tier in the site artifact and things that are tied to the editor experience in the CMS. Important aspect to make this really work is that we wanted your code and your configuration both to be reusable, so you can use proper engineering practices where it makes sense. If you want to have a common base configuration that you use across multiple sites, it should still be possible, but it should also be versionable the same way you would treat a Java code library. It's just a jar artifact. You use Maven versioning like you would for code, and it just works. You can pull in those artifacts and share what makes sense to share. You can evolve independently, but still have some kind of standard that you want to maintain. So day to day, how does this affect you working on a particular project? So there's a basic concept here. Hopefully this makes sense. If you have multiple teams, this should feel somewhat natural. The idea is the central team exists to maintain the CMS and sort of set the standard for how your content model works. You have multiple site teams that can interact with each other to whatever degree makes sense, and you have some kind of operations team that controls the deployments. So different things the central team can take care of and manage the content model, any custom targeting logic that makes sense for your organization. If you want to add custom collectors for our relevance engine, that's still possible to whatever extent that your development teams are managing your audience segmentation. It's the central team that sort of coordinates all of that. And also, of course, many times a site implementation requires changes to the content model to build up a richer set of data that you can use to control your components. So the central team helps make sure that the content model supports whatever is needed for the site, and there's a clear process for how changes can flow into the CMS. They, of course, also deploy the CMS or determine what the release cycle is for those content model changes, doing those kinds of upgrades to the content. And that becomes the baseline that the site development teams can use to build up all the functionality of the components or the whatever technology interactions you need. And then many times, and traditionally this is the most common pattern, that core team is also maintaining a site themselves. Maybe more than one. If you really find the need to deploy those sites independently of each other, you can have flexibility for how you divide up the deployment process for your organization and who gets to decide when things go live. Then you have the site teams. They really have a focus on maintaining a particular site, whether that's a partner or part of a core IT team. The idea is if you work on a particular special purpose site, maybe you work on a site that's meant for a particular geographic region or a particular business unit within your enterprise, et cetera, you can sort of hand that off to a team that has full autonomy to build what makes sense for that situation and to deploy it when it makes sense to go live. They, like I said, will sometimes need to modify the content to enhance it, to add new forms of content, to keep track of things that are new features for a particular site. So that sort of takes the form of a change request that can flow into the CMS. And then you have an ops team, which of course may not actually be a separate team. It may not be human beings at all. It could be a DevOps tool chain of some kind that automates these deployments. In fact, that's best practice, is to sort of let the robots handle the details here. And the role is to just make sure that the latest code for both the CMS and the sites gets deployed in the right places at the right time. Configures load balancing where that makes sense, so traffic for a particular site goes to a cluster node that can handle that, and where necessary, triggers the repository bootstrapping so that if new changes to configuration need to be applied for a particular site, that it happens when that new code is deployed. So, all the developer tooling that you are used to working with the Experience Manager product still works when you have multiple sites, when you're deploying multiple site artifacts at different times. You can still use the project archetype to get started. You can now use that to create a second site project that reuses the CMS artifact, but allows you to test locally with customizations that are specific for your work in progress. So even your development experience is now independent of the central team. You don't have to wait for them to apply your merges before you can test that they're working. Essentials still works, auto export, Maven, all this stuff. It's still just a basic project that you're used to, and everything should still work with your normal workflow. And of course, when you're building a product that needs to survive a long period of time, that you want to scale up to a lot of different use cases across an organization, you need to be able to stay dry, right? Don't repeat yourself. Don't have lots of copy-pasted code or configuration. So we introduced some extra tooling that basically helps you do what comes naturally when you want to refactor something that's reusable. You put it in a shared library. You make that available so that multiple client implementations can take advantage of it. So one detail that helps make this work is this concept of HST config templating. So if you look at the YAML files on disk in a project, all the site configuration is going to use the literal string HST, and then when it's loaded in a particular site, it will apply the appropriate root node that makes sense for that particular site. So if you have, HST colon Asia for some, region-specific subsite, then it would just translate that dynamically on the fly, both when it's deploying and bootstrapping, and also during development when you're doing auto export to make sure everything stays in sync. So you can just sort of move things around naturally, and the system takes care of making sure that it gets rendered in the right way. Code reuse, business as usual, best practices as always. So, okay, that sounds great as far as you've gone. What's the catch? What's the limitation that you need to be aware of? So just a couple of small things. My emojis are gone. Shrug kind of thing. Custom link processors. So this is one of the powerful things about HST, that you can provide your own kind of rendering plugin for how content gets turned into actual URLs in your site. So obviously, if you have code that controls the way that your site behaves, and now that code lives in multiple separate actual deployment artifacts, then all of that code needs to be available so that the appropriate rendering can happen when you're translating content into URLs. So if you use this kind of functionality, it means that you have to deploy all of the code for all of the sites in each of the cluster nodes that might have to do cross-site linking of content. So in practice, you might need a DevOps automation flow that deploys the most recent version of the existing sites that are not changing on that deployment, and then increments to the next version of the site that's about to be changed. So with automation, this is not that big of a restriction. And if you don't use that kind of custom link processor, then you don't need those other sites. You can just deploy the core platform, like in the past we referred to as the repository war, and then also the one site that's going to be used in that particular cluster node. And then your load balancing makes sure that traffic routes to the node that can handle it. This is also, kind of up to you how you manage the flow between the central team and the sites. Obviously, if a site needs some piece of content that hasn't been added to the CMS yet, it can't make use of it yet. So there are some cases where you'll have to think about, what is the forward and backward compatibility of changes that you might make to your CMS. If you have document properties that are crucial to allowing a certain site to function correctly, you can't just remove that and expect things to still work, right? There's a limit to how much independence you can have. But if you, do sensible things to make sure that you move in a compatible way, then you can continue to upgrade sites at a faster pace than the CMS or vice versa as makes sense for you. And then the other possible issue to think about is often a lot of the visual components of the site, the structure of a page is controlled by templates that are in our web files bundles. That's really convenient for development where you can auto-reload those templates as you're going on the fly. And we decided to go on the side of independence and isolation rather than reuse for the moment. So every site war also provides the web file bundle that's going to be used by that site. And that means if most of the templates are reused across sites, you have to manage what is common and needs to stay the same between sites and what is different for that particular site. And we have some ideas about how we can improve that also, and we want to allow for more advanced handling so you can have more flexibility in how you reuse templates, but it's not there in the 13.0 yet. So just something to think about as you're trying to adopt this kind of approach. Hopefully that kind of makes sense, what we're going for, like what kind of benefit that can have for you in allowing your development teams to work more independently and sort of take an ownership over their area of the site that they and the customer experience that they're going to improve. But there's some time left for questions if anybody wants to raise anything.
Thank you. Just to be sure, all of the disparate wires need to be in the same application container?
Only if you're using this kind of custom link processor. In a deployment where you do have that kind of custom URL handling, then yes, they're all in the same Tomcat instance or whatnot. If you want to have an infrastructure that handles each subsite on separate VMs in the cloud, for example, that can work, but the limitation is you can't use this kind of custom link processor.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? No? Okay, then thank you very much.